I'm Lars Janssen. I'm a software architect at Powwow now. I'm not going to give you a sales pitch, but just so you know what that means, we do conference calls, audio conference calls, and also video and collaboration tools. So, like I say, no sales pitch, but at least some context. I've been using PHP for about 10 years, and Symfony2 for 1 year. When I woke up this morning, I don't know why, but I think I had this thought that it's about 1,000 weeks ago since I started playing with HTML. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's just how I think at 6:30 in the morning. And my hobbies: photography, cycling. I don't know. Can you see the bike on the background of that slide? That's just a photo of my bike, so that's my hobbies. Okay, so. So before I start, we have some disambiguation here. Just to avoid confusion, this book, A Year with Symfony, I didn't write that, I don't know anything about it, except that halfway through researching this talk and sort of well after the abstract has sort of been dished out online, I noticed this book and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, that's a familiar title. So I'm going to read this book myself after this talk so that there's no sort of danger of me sort of being influenced too much by it. So what's this talk about anyway? I guess it's kind of a case study. It's a bit of a mixed bag maybe, but I'm just trying to sort of give you guys a view of like how one company has taken Symfony2, kind of adopted it and used it, and just some of the decisions we've made and just some of the things we do, and maybe a few tips in there. Maybe you know it all already, maybe you don't, but anyway. So, sort of a year ago, by the way, I've been with Powwow now for just over a year, and I joined Powwow now quite late in the sort of decision-making process for Symfony2. We had Zend 1 point something, probably quite early versions of Zend 1. We had some code igniter stuff. Some stuff had been done in Symfony 1.4, and I guess that was going quite well. But it's just too many frameworks to learn and maintain, so we've tried to standardise it. So yeah, the challenge is obviously picking a framework. That's one thing. You've got to learn the framework, learn to do something new. You know, because like most frameworks have got some sort of learning curve, and write good code. Because if we're going to start writing new internal systems in Symfony2, we don't want the project to be a kind of beginner's project that then we realise we did it all wrong, and then we've got to throw it all away. So we had to take our time and really get it right. And of course, all while that's going on, you've got existing projects up and running in production, and you've got to maintain those. You know, we've got a customer services system that was based on code igniter, so people have got to add functionality to that sometimes, even though we'd rather rewrite it. So those are some of the challenges. And you know, I think it's quite important to get this right. If we're going to standardise on Symfony2 or any framework, we've got to get this decision right, and we've got to build stuff to last. Because I don't know why I thought of this, the comparison, but I've noticed in my time in IT that a lot of software applications can kind of outlive the average household pet, and here's the evidence of that. Guinea pigs are quite good pets to have if you in terms of software applications, I guess, because they don't last too long, and then you can have a new one. Apologies to anyone who's got a guinea pig. Whereas dogs and cats obviously live longer, but I don't think there's going to be that many dogs and cats that were alive when Windows XP was launched. And yet people are still using it. So anyway, I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts like how long a software application might live.
40 years.
Sorry?
40 years.
40 years. That's probably about right. Cool. Okay, so we've got a few projects in the works here, which I'm not going to go into the actual projects, but obviously it makes sense that we've got to apply our new framework to some real projects. We've got a content management system using the Symfony CMF, which I'm going to touch on later. We've got an internal customer services system, which, as I've mentioned, because it's written in CodeIgniter, I mean, that says it all. It obviously needs rewriting. And we've got another product that we're building, and I can't tell you what it is just yet, but it's going to be cool, and it's going to need a lot of management interface and so on in Symfony2. So why Symfony2? I mean, I'm not religious about these things. Like, if someone told me to code in Zend, then that's fine. But I do like, maybe I'm just getting old, but I do like to go with ones that are well known and well established. Like, I mean, we've got someone at work who's a fan of Laravel, for example, but you know, I'm sure it's lovely, but Zend and Symfony is sort of where all the mind share is. So what do we like? Documentation. It's like, if you ever want people to use your open source project, then documentation has got to be the number one thing. Dependency injection and all that, the service container, just that kind of paradigm. Like, I'd read about dependency injection, but it's kind of hard to apply it if the framework doesn't support it. Documentation, there's a slight theme there. It's designed with testing in mind. Everything's very nicely decoupled, and they've really given thought to the testing. And it's flexible and doesn't get in the way, which I think, to be fair, Zend can offer that as well. And I've missed one off the bottom, but that's documentation. So we had to start out somewhere. Can feel a bit like that. But thanks to the documentation, you've got a little bridge to stand on, so that makes it a bit easier. So the first steps, like, it was kind of fortuitous, really, that kind of just as we were getting started, the SymfonyLive 2012 came to London. I think some of the guys did go to the Paris one as well a few months previously. So, like, I guess if you're here, you've already taken that step. Identify a project. As I say, we did a CMS. By the way, if I were choosing a new project to adopt a new framework, I probably wouldn't go for a CMS, because I've always found CMS a bit hard personally, but it was fun. And it is worth investing the time on the tutorials. So throughout this talk, I might mention a few missteps as well, or just, like, you know, I don't mind admitting, like, that we're flawed and we've made mistakes. And one of them was, like, I think it's kind of easy to sort of be on the wrong version of the documentation. Like, hopefully you've all seen that drop down by now, but if you haven't, then just be careful when you Google it as well, and then you show up back in there, because it's kind of makes learning curve a bit steeper if you're looking at the wrong docs. I've got a slight sort of sysops sort of leaning, and like I like sort of messing around with, like, the Linux file system hierarchy. So what I did here was I looked at the way you specify the where all the logs and cache are stored in Symfony2, and it's like, hang on, that's all within the web application itself. It's like, I'm not sure if I want logs in there. So I got a bit clever, and that's clever in quotes, of course. Got a bit clever and tried to sort of make it so that you can put the logs directories in var log, Symfony2, var cache Symfony2 and stuff. And that works because Symfony is flexible. You just change your app kernel.php and there you go. But actually, I think the Symfony guys kind of are quite clever as well. They've got more experience in this than me, and actually, like, what we found later is that when you've got a deployment mechanism, and each iteration that you deploy is like in a new directory, and maybe there's a symlink to the current version or something, it means that your log files and your cache directory, well, especially your cache directory, is fresh each time already, so there's no chance of messing up. So it's good to play around with these things, but actually the defaults are pretty good anyway. Right. Another thing, like I just put off doing for ages in the early stages was like permissions for your app.dev.php. Like we started off with the UMask, because I thought that setting up ACLs was quite hard. It's something I haven't really got around to in Linux, and even though I run Gen 2 Linux at home and sort of like making life difficult for myself. But actually it's 3 commands to get the ACLs up and running, and that just made it a lot more reliable and easy to manage. Okay, this is sort of flicking. Right, so another decision you have to make is, do you use XML, YAML, annotations, PHP for things like config file? And this is really just a little sort of heads up for what we did. We've gone for YAML because it seems simple and it's kind of the default in a lot of the documentation. Routing is a bit complicated. I've got application routing on the top line there, and then sort of bundle routing. I've made these terms up. Application routing is like if you're in the actual app app config routing.yaml, but then and you specify which bundles you want your router to see, but then for each bundle itself, we can say in the controllers just do annotations, and it kind of looks like this. Is that readable from the back? Because good, because if you can read that from the back, then I can just about read it from this distance here. So good. So yeah, if you look at the annotations there, we've got at root, and then we give it a root name, and that's it, and it's a slash. So it means your routing your routing rules are kind of like tied directly next to the code, but you could also have a big routing.yaml, and like I've worked on a Zend application in a previous job where the routing, I can't remember what format the file was, but the routing file was very long and had about 100 or 200 routes in it or something, and that's maybe what sort of made me feel happier with this, but both are valid. And the app template thing there, it's a bit minimalist really. You can just miss out the template name and it'll guess it for you, or you can specify a different template. So this is another thing we discovered. Like, bear in mind this was a learning curve for me and everyone else in the team. Like, I don't like fat controllers, but this is ridiculous, or at least it seemed that way, It's like, it's got stuff just going in by magic like that, where it says public function index action, and then it's got the $user. That's actually type hinted, so it's not just come off a root parameter. Something's put it there, and there's different things that can do that. One of them is the param converter annotation. I've seen this with the Symfony content management framework as well. So things can just sort of get put in there by magic, and you can have an event listener kernel.controller and have stuff fire before your controller is invoked, so that a lot of the hard work is done before the controller action even runs. Obviously it's worth reading up on that properly, but this is just like, if you haven't encountered that and you're wondering what's going on, then that's what it is. So, is anyone here not familiar with dependency injection, or not sort of using it? Good, because I can skip this bit quite quickly then, but this was a big learning curve, and again, it's easy to look at a slide like this, and you can see that's how to not do it. You've got the new keyword there. This is obviously a very simplified version of dependency injection. You just put it in on the constructor, and then the other one is using the service container. And this is one of the things that I think can get a little bit confusing to start with in Symfony2, because there might be a temptation to pull in the service container and start passing it around, almost use it as a singleton. I was reading a Martin Fowler article on that the other day. Martin Fowler, if you don't know him, is one of the sort of preeminent authors on design patterns. And this way of doing it is actually quite valid. It's just that Symfony2, I think, is more designed the other way. So we've got a slight preference for pure dependency injection, because then you're not even dependent on the service container. But we do obviously use the container as well. And like you will find, for example, with data fixtures loaders or maybe some console commands and various things, you can implement container aware interface, and then you're sort of explicitly saying this class I'm using uses the Symfony2 service container, and then therefore it can pull in all kinds of stuff. But yeah, it took a lot of getting used to, because it's one thing knowing how you should do it in theory, but it's another thing, like when you're working, you're trying to bash code out, you've got to stop and think. You know, think about using the new keyword. You've got to actually, you can't just work on a class, you can't just open that class up in your favourite IDE or editor and write all the code. You've got to actually like open up other classes or service files as well and push things into your class. So yeah, it gave us a lot of thinking to do. The other thing I found interesting about coding with Symfony2 is that you spend a lot of time on the console. I mean, I guess it's very easy to just open up a controller, just find your index controller, and just when you're working on new stuff, debugging, messing around, just sort of put a bit of code in there. But actually you can do all kinds of debug and investigation on the console. I'm sure you've encountered it, but yeah, it's kind of worth revisiting it and just seeing what's in there. And it's also easy to create your own command. So like I say, I don't really want to just open up controllers and put debug code in there. You can literally just copy and paste this command, and like you've got a working command that Symfony just magically picks up. So then you can do app console pwn::hello. PWN is obviously PowWow now, so we use that. And that's it, you've got a command that you can play with. So, working with forms. I'm not going to give you a tutorial on forms because we haven't got 4 hours. So I'm just going to quickly talk about my experience with it. So I've used all kinds of stuff like ZendForm with its kind of decorator patterns, and like years ago, Pair HTML Quick Form. I don't know if anyone's used that, but it was quite difficult. So Symfony2 one is very nicely thought out and decoupled, but again, you've got to do a lot of work to do even a basic form. So it's got the concept of form types. You can make your form type a service to sort of make it easy to access. And we have had cases where I don't know if this is right or wrong, but we have been known to inject dependencies into the form types, and maybe even inject things into the subscribers. So you've got event listeners and you've got data transformers, and they're all worth using. And like in my YouTube playlists, I wouldn't go there if I were you. It's like 99% sort of pop videos from the 90s and stuff, all embarrassing stuff, and then this video. So this is really worth sort of saving. By the way, I'm going to distribute the slides after, so don't try and note down that URL. Yeah, a really good sort of overview of how Symfony2 forms work. So there's a kind of release cycle to Symfony2 now, but there wasn't just as we started. We're on, I think, pretty much 2.1 had just come out. We've been trying to follow the upgrades, the new versions, so we're on 2.3 now on most stuff. But obviously the long-term support thing is quite attractive, so there's going to be a dilemma now. 2.3 is out, and it works nicely. But then around about 4 o'clock or something today, whenever it is, Fabian's going to come along and say, 2.4 is awesome, and we're all going to want to go and use it. So we'll see. I think what I might do is favour long-term support for applications that like might not be maintained very much. But if something's still actively in development and new, then probably 2.4 is safe, but we'll see. And yeah, upgrade with appropriate caution. I always like try and keep my upgrades separate, you know, just like do a branch, upgrade it, test it all, do a pull request and so on. So anyway, we didn't just have to learn Symfony2 because, I mean, everyone here is going to have had different experience in PHP and IT in general. When I came into Symfony2, there were a few things I hadn't encountered. So you end up sort of acquiring or improving knowledge in related areas. So there's Composer. This was the first time I'd used it. Doctrine. I used Doctrine once when I was working for an agency, and like I picked up a project that somebody had started writing in Doctrine, and then they left, and then it was like midnight, and the whole dev team was trying to code on this project and learn Doctrine at the same time. Not the best way to learn it. This is, but with learning it properly with Symfony2, it's really quite enjoyable. And the other thing is, I've learned PHP unit before and tried to retrofit it to projects, and it's been a nightmare. But this time, unit and functional testing, it's so ingrained in the Symfony culture that it was quite easy to get into. So I won't go much on about Composer, but there's just one thing that took me longer than it ought to have to really get into my head, and that's just like how you manage the workflow with it. Because I find the commands a bit confusing. You use update to install stuff, and install to sort of reinstall stuff. So update is what you do when you want new stuff, basically. So you do Composer update, that's easy, but you also use it to install a new package. And then you've got this concept of the composer.lock, which I guess I've just trained myself to ignore files ending in .lock. It's somebody else's problem. They're just using this internal file. But actually, this one I want, it kind of locks, it creates an exact record of all the revisions. Even if you're using dev master from GitHub, then when you do a Composer install against that Composer lock, it's going to be exactly the same. So that was quite good to learn. Committing vendor into SCM is supposedly a bit of a no-no, but that doesn't stop me, so I tried it. And the reason why I wanted it was because I don't want my deployment process to rely on GitHub. GitHub doesn't exactly stay up constantly. You know, we are actually more reliable than GitHub, and therefore, So that's where I started. I decided to sort of take the pain and just be very careful about managing those. You know, you just if you do an update, if you do a Composer update and then commit it, and you don't mix that with other commits, then it's a bit neater. But I've moved away from that now. There is something called Builder, I think, and Satis that we could look at. But in the end, I'm just relying on my deployment process now. Okay, so just a couple of words about Doctrine, and again, this isn't a Doctrine tutorial. So kind of, it's obvious, I guess, that it's probably obvious to most people in this room that you don't want to just put SQL queries all over the place. You'd want to at least keep your SQL queries separately. But using an ORM it goes beyond that. It gives you access to a lot of ways of managing an object. I'm not explaining that very well, but again, like, this isn't a Doctrine tutorial, so I don't have to. Doctrine or Propel. I don't think anyone uses Propel. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. If anyone is, then feel free to correct me. I don't know why. Symfony gives you both options. We've gone with Doctrine, and that's how it is. And again, there's the whole annotations or XML debate, and I really don't think there's a right or wrong way of doing that. So if you're using Doctrine for the first time, then it's potentially a big learning curve, and it's going to feel a bit constrained because you can't just write SQL queries like you're used to doing. It's got its own query language, but again, suddenly you're not just learning Symfony2, you're learning how to do this database abstraction. But if you've used it before, then I think you're going to find, yeah, of course you've got to learn Doctrine, but it feels like it's doing a lot of the hard work for you, and it's actually very useful. But you don't have to use it everywhere just because you've got this tool in your toolbox. Okay, so I have spent a lot of time obsessing over kind of doing the right thing. How am I doing for time? Not too bad. So, trying to do the right thing. So for a start, we try to avoid fat controllers. I have worked on a controller that had about 6,000 lines in it, and it's the only time I've ever ended up dreaming about code. Don't even go there. So we can use basically it's all about pushing things into the entity and the model, using the service classes, using event listeners, which I've mentioned, and just make sure your controller actions is the single responsibility principle. Just make sure your controller actions do one thing. We've been careful not to inject the service container everywhere, because like if you're trying to decouple your classes, injecting the service container is like driving a massive bus through the sort of gap of the coupling. It's like really big, because just by injecting that one service container, the class that is receiving it can now just access the whole application and do all kinds of things. I don't think it's wrong to do it, I just think it's best to think about it and be careful, so we try not to do that. So if a class needs a specific service, we just inject that. So a bit about how we structure our web apps. I'm going to move straight on to the bundle layout actually, because this is probably more relevant. There's a lot of stuff in here. You can lay out your bundles how you like. When I got to the bundle layout, I was thinking, where's the model? Well, the model is kind of everywhere. It's in the entity, kind of, I would say, in the event listener, you could argue. But the controller is obvious. The controller is nice and small and self-contained in its controller thing. And the views are contained, but everything else. By the way, these are typical things we have, but we don't have them all in every bundle. I did have a lot of sleepless nights about bundle coupling, and like, okay, so do you have everything in one bundle, or do you split it up? If you split it up into several bundles, do they all kind of relate to each other? Sort of defeating the object. So we had a few sort of strategies about that. One of them is to sort of use services and configuration, and like this isn't even my example, this is from Sonata, but if you've got your config file and the actual class that some service uses is configurable, then straight away your bundles are quite flexible. If you do have dependencies between bundles, then a one-way dependency is better than two-way. So you might have a kind of core bundle that's got a lot of stuff in it, and maybe a few extra bundles that depend on that, but not the other way around. Just a very quick one on libraries. So we wanted to reuse code between different projects. Once we've obviously got our second Symfony project, just having a bundle in SRC isn't enough. So we pushed it into the vendor directory. This is just a snippet of Composer, but again, you'll have to Google that. But one thing we did find is that when all our bundles in SRC, we had like SRC and then the namespace PWN, but then in vendor, we wanted PWN as well, so we ended up making the individual bundles in SRC a slightly different namespace. There might be a way of having both, but I'm not sure. So there's a lot of third-party bundles we've used. there's just a quick list really. Again, like this is just here's what we use. I don't know if you use them, but Friends of Symfony, FOSS, user bundle. That's a good one for, it gives you like users, passwords, logins, password reset, and the entity to represent a user. KMP menu bundle is great for menus. Doctrine fixtures for loading data fixtures. Sonata admin and Symfony CMF I'm going to mention separately. So here's Sonata admin. And this is just like giving you a kind of CRUD interface for your back office admin system, and it's meant to really speed things up. So as you can see here, you've got a list of things that you can edit if you clicked on them. You've got pagination, you've got filtering, and like in order to get all that, obviously I've got a user entity, but this is all the code I need to produce that whole kind of CRUD thing. So in simple use cases, what have we got? We've got configure form fields, say which fields you want to actually be editable, email, first name, last name. Then we've got another function, configure list fields, and that's the list on the screen. I'll just jump back so you can configure which fields are in this list. So not a lot of code, you just extend the Sonata admin class and have fun. So Sonata, the documentation is not the best documentation, but there is a reasonable amount of it. Look out for the hyperlink. This seems silly, but like I think some people I've seen struggling to find pages on the Sonata admin site because they've got black hyperlinks. There's a couple of other Sonata bundles, block bundle, user bundle. And we're currently trying to decide whether to use Sonata for our customer services screen or just kind of go it alone and build our own. Because Sonata, I find, can get in the way more than Symfony does in the more advanced use cases. Bit of a learning curve. And actually Symfony Form might do the job anyway. There's another project. This needs another 4 hours, so we'll skip the detail. The content management framework is well worth a look. So it's got a few bundles, a routing bundle, which you can use independently to sort of really soup up the Symfony routing, block menu bundles. The content block concept is actually linked into Sonata's content blocks, so there's a lot of tying in there. And it's got a whole storage abstraction behind it, the PHP content repository, or PHP CR, so that's well worth looking at. I'm going to skip this one because it's pretty basic, but this is just how you structure the content in there. You can just structure it as a hierarchy rather than in SQL tables. So I went to the Hack Day in Zurich in June, and they were hoping to sort of get 1.0 out within a couple of weeks of that. They're on release candidate 1 now, and it is very close to being released, and therefore it's a good time to jump on board because it's not going to be changing so much. So this is the last section, testing. So different types of testing that are possible. I'm not really big on definitions, like you can call it TDD, BDD, and so on, and make all kinds of distinctions. We've got functional tests and web tests you could probably just put together. Functional test is like, let's say you're not using mocks, you're just using one class. You're testing one class, maybe it's a doctrine repository class that you've written. So when you're testing that class, you're kind of testing doctrine as well, so it's not a pure unit test, but it's not a web test where you're actually testing the web form and the user clicking on there. There's also unit tests, which is the basic ones. By the way, there's I think a lot of talk at the moment about using PHP spec instead of PHP unit, and look out for the talk later about that. But at the moment, we've used plain old-fashioned PHP unit. It's reliable, proven, and we can integrate it. there's a few test bundles that you can use to sort of either learn from or speed things up. Leap functional test bundle, it's good for testing the certain doctrine stuff and other things and commands. I think they've got ICE InstaClick based test bundle, that's worth a look. And I'm hoping to open source our own test bundle in the next few days, but there's a small matter of documentation, so that should be coming soon. So another experience I want to share is the experience of unit testing forms in Symfony2. I'm not sure if you need to do it or not. Certainly, if you want to spend an awful lot of time creating like hundreds of mocks, then get a really complex Symfony form with event listeners and subscribers and try and unit test it. And by the end of it, you'll be like able to write mocks in your sleep. But otherwise, I think I'm tempted to sort of just rely on functional tests. It depends on the size of the project and the resources available anyway. And if you do unit test Symfony forms, look out for the test classes, because there's an instance where the interface, if you're extending, if their interface, because it's best to mock the interface, if their interface implements iterator, then there's something weird with PHP unit, and their own test classes can be used as mocks, and you can mock their test classes, and that works a lot better. So functional testing, this is a bit of an obvious recap probably, but we use the client and the crawler extensively. The client, I mean, it was quite a revelation for me that their functional testing is like faking the whole HTTP request, and that really like speeds things up. And the crawler just like filtering through stuff, looking at the like this example here, I've got div foo.bar. You can filter on a div that's in two classes, and then EQ0 means look for the first instance of that, get the text for it, and then you can make assertions based on that. But the last thing I want to talk about is JavaScript testing, because most web applications these days have JavaScript on them, and I wanted something that gives me kind of automated testing, something that I can run headless in the continuous integration system and not actually rely on manually running it in a real browser. I looked at something called Zombie, which is quite nice. It's written in Node.js, Zombie, pure JS testing framework, but it was a little bit immature. I found it a bit difficult getting it working. Your experience might be different. So I've settled on Phantom.js, which is a headless WebKit browser, and Casper.js, which is a test framework to drive that. And then our own bundle, and this is why I want to open source it, just to save someone the work if they want to do this. We integrate the two together. So this is how it works. We'll create a web app test. So you obviously know the app_dev.php. Well, you don't normally need an app_test.php because the Symfony test components fake the whole HTTP interaction, but that isn't going to work with Phantom.js. So we've made a copy of that file, set up a web server, and then you basically create your Casper.js tests and load it from there. And we're out of time, so I'm just going to, I'll upload these later, but there's just a couple of things I really wish I'd seen, especially that bottom one. It just makes debugging really easy when you have redirects. And then, so we've now got 3 major Symfony2 projects in the pipeline. And like, I think it's been a great journey. Like writing maintainable code feels natural now, and we probably haven't got time for questions, but just catch me later. I don't look geeky enough, so they've given me a speaker T-shirt, so I'll put that on later. You can find me, ask any questions you like. And by the way, we're hiring, so find me again if you need to.